When seeking to remedy a problem that affects society as a whole, it's important that we're able to objectively and thoroughly identify its causes, as well as anticipate the likely consequences of our solutions to it. Some of these causes and consequences are direct, while others are indirect. The indirect causes and consequences aren't necessarily less important because they are indirect. However, they are more difficult to spot. They are, for the same reason, easier to ignore if there's a political reason to ignore them. I'm reminded of a story involving Martin O'Malley and his bid to be the Democratic nominee in the 2016 presidential election. O'Malley was mocked by many conservatives for having suggested that climate change contributed to the rise of ISIS. It turns out that there was a scientific basis for that claim. Climate change led to a drought which drove many Syrians from their farms and into cities like Damascus. This in turn put tremendous pressure on local governments which couldn't meet the basic needs of their growing populations. The increasing hardship served to radicalize people, making them more likely to join militant groups like ISIS. Now, this theory linking climate change and the rise of ISIS is easy to understand, but it's also easy to ridicule, especially if you're a climate skeptic, because the causal link is so indirect. One might suspect that there is a disincentive to promote such theories, even if they are otherwise plausible. This is especially true in the present political context where anything, even an issue of life and death, is vulnerable to being shamelessly weaponized by political rivals in their struggle for power. Those in positions of influence and power seem to have prioritized power over truth and public health. Perhaps this is one reason why we have such low confidence in the media and our political institutions. What else can we expect of our leaders? After all, in our secular culture, where God seems to have been largely displaced as their object of devotion, little else but power remains. With respect to the coronavirus outbreak, I wish to direct attention not to the causes of this particular problem, but to the likely consequences of our solutions to it. In limiting our focus to metrics like infection or fatality rates, we measure a solution's effectiveness by whether these rates are declining. And this, of course, makes sense. Obviously, any decent person wants fewer people to be infected by and die from this virus. But I find this approach very myopic. We've ignored or at least downplayed the likely consequences of one particular solution, i.e., the lockdowns that have been enforced throughout the country, to which COVID deaths may pale in comparison. I was listening to a 2016 BBC interview where Dr. Harvey Brenner from the University of Texas Health Sciences Center lent credence to a statistic which was popularized by Brad Pitt in the 2015 movie The Big Short, that for every percent increase in unemployment, there are 40,000 deaths. If this is correct, then we should expect that the 15.6% increase in unemployment that has been largely induced by the government's response to the outbreak will cause 624,000 deaths. Contrast this with the less than 77,000 deaths that have thus far been linked to COVID-19. Why don't we give this statistic proper attention when evaluating government solutions to the pandemic? Perhaps it's because the link between unemployment and mortality is indirect. It's thus harder to perceive. It's also easier to ignore or ridicule, especially by a sizable portion of our politically active population, because this is a quote-unquote conservative statistic. So in our polarized culture, where we're less interested in the truth than in what our political party says is true, our response to the statistic depends to some extent on where we stand politically. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that conservatives are actually more concerned about public health than liberals are. I'm sure that the conservative push to quote-unquote reopen America is driven to some degree by greed. I'll judge the sincerity of anyone calling to reopen America by whether he manifests a genuine desire to ensure that employees are protected while working in this uncertain environment. My point is merely that our ability to fight the coronavirus is to some extent explained by this, if you will, epistemic deficiency. It seems to me that this problem accounts for how we typically understand the contrasting experiences of two otherwise similar countries, Norway and Sweden. Norway opted for a lockdown very early on, whereas Sweden was unique in avoiding a lockdown. There are currently 301 deaths per million people in Sweden. The comparable figure in Norway is a much lower 40. It is tempting, therefore, to say that Norway is much better off than Sweden. But we can't limit our comparison to this metric. 2 weeks ago, Reuters reported that unemployment in Norway surged to 15.3%, up from 3.5% in March. Around the same time, the New York Times reported that unemployment in Sweden was at a lower 8%, up from 7.1% in March. It would be interesting to compare the two countries when more data, especially mortality data, comes in. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that Sweden will be better off than Norway. At the end of the day, there's so much uncertainty concerning this pandemic, and I tend to distrust anyone who claims to be certain. However, if we're genuinely interested in forming a comprehensive pro life view on this crisis, such numbers cannot be ignored.